Chains rattled as the candlelight flickered against the grand hall of the plantation house. It was New Year's night, 1850. The master raised his glass, the mistress laughed, and the overseer boasted of punishments he had delivered. None of them noticed the trembling hands of the slaves serving their feast. Every dish carried more than food, it carried revenge. By dawn, the plantation would be silent, and the slave who had been broken in chains would shock the world forever. The year was 1850, in the humid heart of Louisiana. The land was endless, rows of cotton fields stretching to the horizon, their white blooms glowing under the scorching sun by day, and silver under the moonlight by night. It was here, on the grounds of the Belle Grove Plantation, that the story of Samuel began. Samuel was born into chains. His first cries as an infant echoed inside a wooden cabin made of rough pine boards, crowded with the bodies of other enslaved men and women. His mother, Ruth, whispered lullabies to him at night, her voice trembling with exhaustion. She prayed her son would one day see freedom. But on this plantation, freedom was nothing more than a dangerous dream. The master of Belle Grove, William Harrow, was a man of wealth and reputation. To the outside world, he appeared refined, dressed in tailored suits, attending church every Sunday with his wife on his arm. But behind the plantation gates, his true nature revealed itself. He was cruel, arrogant, and merciless to the slaves he owned. For him, they were property, nothing more than tools to extract cotton, sugarcane, and profit from the land. Beside him was Mistress Eleanor Harrow. She was a woman of vanity, known for her jeweled gowns and elaborate feasts. She never dirtied her hands, never looked into the eyes of those who cooked her meals or scrubbed her floors. Yet her indifference was its own cruelty. She allowed suffering to flourish under her roof, never questioning, never intervening, treating the enslaved like shadows on the wall. But it was the overseer, Thomas Graves, who made life unbearable. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a leather whip always dangling from his belt, he ruled the fields with violence. His voice carried across the plantation like a storm, his punishments swift and merciless. Slaves who faltered under the sun, who failed to meet the daily quota, were lashed until their backs bled raw. Some were left tied to posts for hours, their skin burning under the Louisiana heat. Others, those who dared to resist, were hanged from the very trees that shaded the fields. Samuel grew under this reign of terror. By the time he was 10, he was already working in the cotton rows, hands blistered and cut from thorns. He learned quickly that mistakes meant pain, that silence was safer than words, and that hope was a dangerous thing. Yet despite the cruelty, there was a fire inside him that never fully dimmed. At night, when the day's labor ended and the quarters fell into hushed whispers, Samuel would listen to the elders. They told stories of Africa, of ancestors who had walked freely under wide skies. They sang spirituals that carried both sorrow and strength. In those moments, Samuel felt a flicker of something he couldn't name, something larger than chains, larger than the plantation itself. But life had its way of crushing even the strongest spirits. When Samuel was 16, his mother fell ill. She was weak from years of labor and beatings. Samuel tried to care for her, sneaking extra scraps of food, fetching water when he could. But one cold night, Overseer Thomas stormed into their cabin, accusing Ruth of laziness, claiming she hadn't done her share in the fields. Before Samuel's eyes, the overseer struck her down with his whip. She died within days. Samuel never forgot the sound of that whip, nor the laughter of Thomas as he walked away. It was then that Samuel's silence hardened into something darker. He worked, he obeyed, but inside, he carried a weight that grew heavier with every lash, every insult, every loss. By his early 20s, Samuel had been assigned to the main house as a servant. He carried trays of food, polished silver, and stood silently as the Harrows entertained wealthy guests. He watched the master drink fine wine while slaves in the fields went hungry. He watched the mistress show off her gowns while mothers wept for children sold to other plantations. Samuel's hands trembled with rage as he poured drinks and cleared plates, but his face never betrayed him. The holidays were the cruelest of all. At Christmas and New Year, the Harrows threw lavish feasts. The dining hall filled with candlelight, music, and laughter. Roast pig, sweet pies, and spiced wine overflowed from the table. Samuel and the other house slaves prepared every dish, their stomachs empty, their throats dry. They stood in the shadows, serving those who saw them as less than human, forbidden to touch the food they cooked. Yet, these feasts also revealed something else, a weakness. The master, the mistress, the overseer. All of them indulged themselves recklessly. They drank until their speech slurred, ate until their stomachs ached, boasted until their voices cracked. In those moments of excess, Samuel saw the fragile thread holding their power. They were not gods. They were not invincible. They were men and women, blind in their arrogance, drunk on their own wealth. As the year 1849 ended, whispers of rebellion stirred among the slaves. Some spoke of running north, others of fighting back. Most were too afraid. The punishments for rebellion were brutal, often fatal. But Samuel listened quietly, his mind sharp, his anger coiled like a snake. He knew escape was nearly impossible. Patrols scoured the roads, dogs tracked runaways, and those who were caught faced torture. No, escape was not his path. His path was different. What Samuel wanted was not freedom alone. He wanted justice. He wanted the master to feel the pain of loss, the overseer to know fear, the mistress to choke on the silence she had forced upon so many. He wanted their laughter to die in their throats. And as New Year's approached, a plan began to form in his mind, one so dangerous, so unthinkable, that even the thought of it made his heart race. The plantation prepared for another feast, grander than the year before. Guests were expected, the dining hall polished, the kitchen stocked. Samuel was ordered to assist in every detail. To William Harrow, he was just another pair of hands. To Eleanor, he was invisible. To Thomas, he was a dog kept on a leash. But Samuel was no longer a silent shadow. He was the storm that no one saw coming. And on the night of the New Year's feast, 1850, Samuel's silence would end. The final days of December brought little comfort to the slaves of Belle Grove Plantation. While the master and mistress prepared for celebration, the fields knew no rest. Cotton still needed gathering, livestock still needed tending, and overseer Thomas Graves prowled with his whip like a hungry wolf. The season that promised joy for the wealthy only brought exhaustion and despair for the enslaved. Samuel moved through the kitchen and dining hall, polishing silver trays until his hands blistered. The smell of roasted meat and sweet pies filled the air, but he tasted none of it. His meals were little more than scraps, corn mush, a stale crust of bread, sometimes a slice of salted pork if fortune favored him. The difference between the overflowing banquet tables and the empty bowls of the quarters was enough to stoke a fire of bitterness in every enslaved heart. But it was not hunger alone that deepened Samuel's rage. It was the cruelty of Thomas Graves, the overseer whose presence turned every day into a nightmare. Thomas was a man who thrived on punishment. When slaves faltered in the field, whether from heat, illness, or sheer exhaustion, Thomas showed no mercy. He lashed them until blood soaked their shirts or tied them to posts where the sun baked their skin. Once, Samuel had seen him bury a man up to his neck in the dirt, leaving him under the blistering sun while insects crawled across his face. The man screamed for hours until his voice broke. That day, something inside Samuel cracked. The master did nothing to stop such acts. In fact, William Harrow encouraged them. Fear is the only language these creatures understand, he had once said at a feast, his voice dripping with arrogance, his glass raised high. Samuel had stood nearby, tray in hand, His jaw clenched so tightly he thought his teeth would shatter. Mistress Eleanor was no less complicit. She did not carry the whip, but she carried silence, a silence that allowed horrors to unfold under her roof. She spent her days draped in silk gowns, fretting over fabrics, jewels, and the gossip of other plantation wives. When Samuel's mother Ruth died from the overseer's beating, Eleanor said nothing. When children were sold away from their mothers, Eleanor looked away. Her silence was its own blade, sharper than Thomas's whip. The cruelty was not only physical, it was spiritual. Every Sunday, the Harrows forced the slaves to attend church services led by a preacher who preached obedience. "Slaves, obey your masters," he recited from the pulpit, his voice echoing through the wooden chapel. Samuel sat among the congregation, his chains digging into his wrists, listening as the words twisted scripture into shackles. Even the sanctuary offered no refuge. It was a place where faith was bent into a weapon. Yet, despite everything, the slaves found ways to hold on to fragments of humanity. At night, in the quarters, they sang in hushed voices, songs of sorrow, songs of hope. Samuel listened to the rhythm of the voices, the hum of resilience that refused to die. But when the songs ended and silence fell, the rage inside him returned stronger than before. The breaking point came one winter evening, just days before the New Year's feast. Samuel was ordered to deliver firewood to the fields, where Thomas was overseeing work long after the sun had set. In the pale glow of the moon, Samuel saw a boy no older than 12 struggling to carry a sack of cotton. His arms shook, his knees buckled. Thomas sneered, grabbed the boy by the hair, and dragged him to the whipping post. The sound of the lash cracked through the cold night, slicing the silence like thunder. Samuel's hands trembled around the wood he carried. Each lash was like a drumbeat in his skull, echoing his mother's screams, his own childhood pain. He turned away, but the cries of the boy followed him into the dark. That night, Samuel could not sleep. His heart pounded with the rhythm of the whip, each beat whispering the same word, enough. Still, he held his silence. Still, he waited. The Harrows' New Year's feast promised to be the grandest of the decade. Guests from neighboring plantations were invited. Barrels of wine were brought up from the cellar, hogs slaughtered, spices ground by hand. Samuel worked from dawn until nightfall, preparing food he would never taste. He stood in the kitchen, sweat dripping down his back from the roaring fires, the air thick with the scent of roasting meat and boiling stews. But as he chopped herbs, ground pepper, and poured wine into crystal decanters, his mind was elsewhere. Every cut of the knife, every sprinkle of spice, every polished glass, these became pieces of something larger. A plan. A dangerous, unthinkable plan. The cruelty of the master, the indifference of the mistress, the sadism of the overseer, Samuel carried them all in his memory. Each face, each lash, each loss. They gathered inside him like storm clouds. And he knew, as the clock ticked toward New Year's Eve, that the storm was about to break. Because this feast would not be like the others. This feast would not end with laughter and toasts. It would end in silence. And what Samuel was preparing in secret would ensure that none of them, master, mistress, overseer, nor guest, would live to see another dawn. The final day of the year dawned cold and gray, but inside the Belle Grove Plantation house, the air crackled with anticipation. Servants rushed about, sweeping the grand hall, polishing silver, laying fresh linens across the long wooden table that stretched like a symbol of the master's wealth. Guests were expected from neighboring estates, planters, their wives, their children. The Harrows prided themselves on throwing the most extravagant celebration in the parish. And in the center of it all was Samuel. By now, he had earned a reputation as one of the most reliable house servants. He was trusted to handle food, wine, and the fine details of preparation. The master never suspected the rage that smoldered behind his calm eyes, nor did the mistress question his trembling hands when he set a plate before her. To them, Samuel was invisible, an obedient shadow. And it was this invisibility that gave him power. In the kitchen, the fire roared in the hearth. Pans hissed as meat sizzled, the scent of garlic and spices filling the room. The kitchen slaves moved quickly, heads bowed, each step calculated to avoid the overseer's wrath. But Samuel's movements carried an extra weight, a secret that no one else knew. Hidden in the folds of his clothing was the weapon he had been gathering piece by piece. A powder, pale and bitter, ground from roots he had stolen from the edge of the swamp. Some said the plants were poisonous, deadly if mixed into food or drink. Samuel had tested them in small ways, feeding traces to rats that crept into the cabins. He had seen them convulse, choke, and die within hours. He knew what it could do. The risk was unimaginable. If anyone discovered him tampering with the food, the punishment would be swift and merciless. He would be hanged in the yard, his body left to rot as a warning to others. The overseer would relish such a death. And yet, as Samuel stood over the boiling pots and simmering stews, he felt no fear, only purpose. That morning, while the others prepared bread and roasted meats, Samuel moved with careful precision. Into the decanter of wine, he sprinkled the powder, stirring gently until it dissolved. Into the rich gravy that would be poured over roasted pork, he added another measure. Into the sweet pies, hidden beneath layers of sugar and spice, he slipped just enough to bring silence to those who would eat. His heart pounded as he worked, each beat like a drum echoing in his ears. Sweat stung his eyes. His hands trembled, but his face remained calm. Around him, the kitchen bustled with activity, pots clanging, knives chopping, voices murmuring. None of them noticed what Samuel was doing. None of them dared to look too closely. But danger was never far. At one point, Thomas Graves stormed into the kitchen, boots clattering against the floor. His eyes swept the room like a predator scanning for prey. "Hurry it up," he barked, striking the table with the flat of his whip. "The master wants the food ready by nightfall. If anything's late, it'll be your hides." Samuel froze, his hand hovering over the pot of stew. For one terrifying moment, Thomas's gaze landed on him. The overseer's eyes narrowed, suspicious, as if sensing something out of place. Samuel forced himself to keep moving, ladling broth into a bowl, pretending to taste for salt. The spoon touched his lips, bitter, metallic, but he swallowed the fear and forced a nod of approval. Thomas sneered, spat on the floor, and stormed back out. Only then did Samuel breathe again. His hands shook as he set the spoon aside. He had come within inches of discovery, but the plan remained intact. As the day wore on, the kitchen transformed into a frenzy. The smell of roasted hog filled the air, mingling with cinnamon and nutmeg from the pies. Wine bottles lined the counter, ready to be carried into the hall. Samuel moved among them like a shadow, slipping his poison into one dish after another. Yet with every step, a voice inside him whispered questions. What if they notice the taste? What if the poison fails? What if the slaves who serve are forced to eat? Samuel had thought of this. He planned carefully, ensuring only the dishes reserved for the master, the mistress, the overseer, and their guests were touched. The servants would eat nothing until the feast was over, just as it had always been. He whispered silent prayers that his people would not share the same fate. When the preparations were complete, Samuel stepped back and surveyed the table. Trays of golden meat, bowls of steaming stew, baskets of bread still warm from the oven, pies glistening with sugar, and bottles of wine that glowed red like blood in the candlelight. To anyone else, it was a feast of celebration. To Samuel, it was justice plated and poured. Night fell quickly. The grand hall filled with laughter as guests arrived, their carriages rumbling across the gravel path. The sound of boots on polished wood echoed through the house. Music drifted in from the parlor, fiddles and violins striking lively tunes. Women in silk gowns whispered behind fans. Men in waistcoats boasted of harvests and profits. Samuel moved silently among them, pouring wine, offering trays of food. His chains clinked softly as he passed from guest to guest. None looked at him twice. To them, he was invisible. To him, they were already ghosts. He glanced once across the room to where Thomas Graves stood near the master, drinking heavily. The overseer laughed, his voice loud and cruel, recounting how he had whipped a boy nearly to death just days before. The master clapped him on the back, approving. The mistress raised her glass, her jeweled fingers sparkling in the candlelight. Samuel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He moved from one end of the table to the other, watching as wine poured into crystal goblets, as spoons dipped into stew, as knives cut into meat. Each bite, each swallow, drew them closer to the edge of silence. And then, as the clock struck 9, the feast began in earnest. The guests ate greedily, drinking deep, laughing louder with each passing moment. Samuel stood by the wall, hands folded, his face expressionless. But inside, his heart raced like a drum. Because he knew there was no turning back now. The poison was already in their veins. The night that had begun in laughter would not end that way. The candles in the grand hall flickered against polished silver and crystal. Shadows danced across the walls as laughter echoed beneath the high ceilings. The New Year's feast of 1850 had begun, and Belle Grove Plantation was alive with indulgence. At the head of the long table sat William Harrow, master of the estate, his chest puffed like a rooster. On his right, Mistress Eleanor sparkled with jewels, her fan fluttering lazily as if to stir the air of her own vanity. Beside them, Overseer Thomas Graves slouched with his wine goblet already half empty, his booming laugh drowning out the music from the parlor. Around them gathered planters and their wives, all dressed in silks and fine coats, their voices filled with arrogance, their bellies hungry for the feast before them. And in the shadows, Samuel stood. Chains clinked softly as he moved along the walls, his face unreadable, his eyes steady. In his hands, he carried trays of food, bottles of wine, offerings of labor and servitude. Yet Samuel knew what the others did not, that every dish, every sip, carried the weight of revenge. The overseer raised his glass first, his words slurred but his tone cruel. To the master, to the mistress, and to this fine land that keeps us rich. The room erupted in cheers, goblets raised high. Samuel poured wine into each glass, watching the crimson liquid swirl like blood in the candlelight. He lowered his eyes, hiding the flicker of fire behind them. The first bites were taken with delight. The guests moaned over the flavor of the roasted hog, praised the spice pies, marveled at the richness of the gravy. Mistress Eleanor beamed, as if the food's splendor were her own doing, though every bite had passed through Samuel's hands. The master boasted of the harvest, his voice loud, his words dripping with pride. Thomas Graves mocked the slaves in the fields, recounting their punishments as if they were tales of humor. The table roared with laughter, forks clattering against plates. But Samuel remained silent. He moved from guest to guest, refilling glasses, setting trays down, collecting empty dishes. He saw every mouthful swallowed, every sip of poisoned wine taken. And as the minutes passed, his heart beat faster. It began subtly. A planter's wife dabbed at her lips with a handkerchief, her brow furrowed. She set down her fork, pressing a hand to her stomach. Another guest shifted uncomfortably in his chair, coughing into his napkin. The overseer reached for another slice of meat, but his hand trembled slightly as he lifted the knife. Samuel watched closely. His palms were damp, his chest tight. He forced himself to remain still, to breathe evenly, to look no different than he always had. Then the symptoms spread. A loud cough broke the chatter, followed by another. A goblet slipped from a guest's hand, shattering against the floor. The mistress turned in annoyance, ready to scold the clumsiness, until she herself gasped, her hand clutching her throat. Her jeweled rings glittered as her fingers dug into her skin. Her face paled, then flushed, as if the very air were choking her. The master rose from his seat, anger flashing in his eyes. "What is the meaning of this?" he bellowed. But his voice faltered. He swayed on his feet, his goblet tumbling from his grasp, dark red wine pooling across the white linen. His face twisted in pain, his hands gripping the edge of the table as his body convulsed. Panic erupted. Guests staggered from their seats, chairs toppling, plates crashing to the floor. Screams pierced the air as one after another collapsed. Forks clattered from trembling hands, napkins fluttered to the ground like fallen leaves. The music from the parlor screeched to a halt, musicians peering wide-eyed into the hall as chaos unfolded. Thomas Graves tried to stand, his face flushed, sweat pouring down his temples. He cursed, his words slurred, reaching for the whip at his belt even as his knees buckled. He staggered toward Samuel, his eyes wild, spittle on his lips. "What did you?" But the words never finished. His legs gave out, his massive body crashing to the floor, the whip slipping from his grasp. Samuel stood over him, his face calm at last. Years of rage, years of pain, years of silence, all focused in this single moment as he looked down at the overseer who had tormented him and so many others. Thomas's eyes bulged, his mouth foamed, his hands clawed at the wooden floorboards. Then, with a final shudder, he lay still. The mistress screamed, but her voice was broken, choked by the poison searing through her veins. She collapsed into her chair, her jeweled hands twitching once before falling limp at her sides. The master's convulsions shook the table, toppling goblets, scattering silverware. His face turned a sickly shade of gray as his breaths grew shallow. Within minutes, the hall that had roared with laughter fell silent, broken only by gasps, moans, and the rattling breaths of the dying. Smoke from the fireplace drifted through the air, mingling with the stench of spilled wine and vomit. The glow of candles flickered over faces contorted in agony. Shadows stretched across the walls like skeletal hands reaching out to claim their victims. The grand feast, the pride of Belle Grove, had become a slaughterhouse. And through it all, Samuel stood unmoving. Around the edges of the room, other slaves huddled in silence, their eyes wide with fear and disbelief. Some trembled, clutching one another, terrified of what this meant. Others stared at Samuel with something deeper, something that looked like awe. They had seen countless whippings, countless deaths, countless nights of suffering. But never this. Never the master brought low, never the overseer silenced, never the mistress stripped of her power. The hall grew quieter. One by one, the last gasps faded, the bodies stilled. The master's hand slipped from the table, his ring glinting one final time before his lifeless body collapsed. The mistress's jeweled fan fell to the floor, broken and useless. The overseer's whip lay beside him, coiled like a dead serpent. Silence. For the first time, true silence filled the grand hall. No orders. No laughter. No lash of the whip. Only the crackle of the fire and the slow, steady breath of Samuel. He looked around the room, his chains clinking softly as he moved. For years, those chains had bound him, weighed him down, marked him as less than human. Now they were the only sound left in the house of his oppressors. He tightened his fists around them, feeling their cold bite against his skin. And then, something stirred inside him. A strength he had never known. A sense of power, not stolen, not given, but claimed. The house that had stood as a monument to cruelty was silent because of him. The laughter that had mocked his pain was silenced by his hands. The chains that had defined his life no longer defined his soul. As midnight approached, the echoes of the feast had died. The new year would begin not with joy and music, but with ash and silence. Some whispered later that Samuel himself set fire to the house before fleeing, flames devouring the grand hall until nothing remained but charred beams and ashes. Others claimed he simply walked out into the night, leaving the corpses of the Harrows and their guests to rot in the shadows of their wealth. But what Samuel did next shocked everyone. The night after the feast was like no other in Belle Grove's history. The plantation, once filled with the noise of orders, footsteps, and whips, lay in eerie silence. The grand dining hall, where laughter and boasting had echoed hours before, was now nothing more than a graveyard. Plates sat overturned, goblets spilled, and the air hung heavy with the scent of death. But Samuel did not linger. Some say that after watching the last breath leave his master's lips, he walked calmly through the hall, past the fallen bodies of guests and overseer alike. His chains rattled softly as he stepped into the cool night air, the stars above brighter than he had ever seen them. The world beyond the plantation stretched wide and free, and for the first time, Samuel took a step toward it without fear. Others claimed that he was not free for long, that the next morning, riders from neighboring plantations arrived, alerted by the eerie silence and the absence of carriages returning from the feast. They found the hall filled with corpses, their mouths twisted in agony, their eyes wide with terror. In their panic, they searched for survivors, but the only names spoken on trembling lips were the slave, Samuel. The manhunt began at once. Bloodhounds were released, patrols combed the swamps, and the woods filled with men carrying torches and guns. Some whispered that Samuel was captured within days, dragged back in chains, beaten beyond recognition. That he was hanged in front of the remaining slaves, his body left to rot as a warning. But others whispered a different story. That Samuel evaded the hunters, slipping deep into the swamps where no dogs could follow, vanishing into the thick mist and cypress trees. They said he joined others who had escaped, forming a hidden community, free under the canopy of the wild. That his story spread like wildfire, carried from plantation to plantation in hushed tones, a tale of vengeance that gave strength to the hopeless. Whether Samuel lived or died, one truth could not be denied. The Harrows were gone. The overseer was gone. The plantation's power was shattered in a single night of reckoning. For the slaves who remained, the aftermath was complicated. Fear hung over them, for white planters across the parish cracked down with even harsher punishments, terrified of rebellion. Yet in secret, in the quiet of the cabins, Samuel's name was spoken with reverence. Mothers whispered his story to their children by firelight. Elders sang songs that carried his memory, blending sorrow with defiance. His act was dangerous to remember, but impossible to forget. The legend of Samuel spread beyond Belle Grove. In the years that followed, travelers spoke of the cursed plantation where a master's feast had turned into a funeral. Some swore the grand house was haunted, its walls echoing with the choking gasps of the dying, its halls forever tainted by the blood spilled that night. Others said the land itself resisted crops, as if the earth remembered and refused to yield under the weight of such cruelty. But for those who still wore chains, Samuel's story was more than legend. It was proof. Proof that even the most powerless could strike against the mighty. Proof that the whip could be silenced, that the master's voice could be stopped. Proof that vengeance, though costly, was possible. Historians would later debate the truth. Was Samuel real, or just a story born from desperation? Were the details exaggerated over time, turned into myth? Perhaps. But within the hearts of those who suffered, Samuel was as real as the chains on their wrists. And maybe that was the point. Because Samuel was not just one man, he was every man and woman who had been beaten, every child torn from a mother's arms, every soul crushed under the weight of slavery. His silence was theirs. His rage was theirs. His revenge was theirs. Whether he lived or died, Samuel's act became immortal, not in books, not in records, but in the whispers of the enslaved, carried like a torch in the darkness. And so the story ends where it began. in silence. The silence of a plantation house stripped of its laughter. The silence of a master who would never give another order. The silence of chains lying empty on the floor. But this silence was different. This silence was victory. And as the New Year's sun rose over Belle Grove Plantation in 1850, its golden light touched the ashes of a feast that had turned to death, and the faint echoes of a story that would never die. Chains may bind the body, the story whispers, but not the soul. And on that New Year's night, one slave proved that even in silence, revenge can roar.